Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering your country no longer exists. That's exactly what happened to millions of Koreans. Today, North Korea and South Korea seem like completely different worlds. But they weren't always two countries. For centuries, Korea was one nation, one people, one culture, one shared history. Then, in 1910, everything changed. Japan formally annexed Korea. For the next 35 years, Korea lived under Japanese colonial rule. Korean culture was suppressed. Their language was restricted. Many Koreans were forced into labor. And resistance was often met with brutal punishment. But the Korean people did not simply accept it. In 1919, thousands of Koreans took to the streets demanding independence. It became known as the March First movement. The movement was crushed, but the desire for freedom wasn't. Korean resistance continued. Some fought inside Korea. Others organized resistance movements abroad. Then, the Second World War changed everything. Japan had built a massive empire across Asia, and Korea had become part of that empire. But by 1945, Japan was losing the war, its empire was collapsing. Then came August 1945. Japan surrendered. After 35 years of occupation, Korea was finally free. People poured into the streets. Korean flags appeared everywhere. Families celebrated. For the first time in generations, Koreans could believe their country belonged to them again. But they didn't know what was coming. Because Korea had been liberated before the Koreans themselves could decide what came next. And thousands of miles away, two powerful nations were already making plans. The United States and the Soviet Union. They were supposed to help determine what happened to Korea after Japan's defeat. But somewhere inside those discussions, a line was drawn across the Korean Peninsula, a line that was supposed to be temporary, a line that would eventually separate millions of people, a line that would change world history. So who drew that line? Why was it drawn? And how did one country become two? That's where the story really begins. In part 2, we uncover the decision that split Korea in half. Imagine someone drawing a line on a map, and that single line dividing an entire nation. In August 1945, two American officers were given almost no time to decide where that line should go. They looked at a map of Korea, then they chose the 38th parallel. But why there? And why did the Soviet Union agree? The answer begins with Japan's sudden surrender. By August 1945, Japan was collapsing. The atomic bombs had devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. Suddenly, Soviet forces were moving into Korea from the north, and the United States had a problem. American troops were nowhere near Korea. The Soviets could reach the peninsula much faster. If nothing was decided, the Soviet Union could potentially occupy all of Korea. So American officials needed a plan, and they needed one quickly. On the night of August 10, 1945, inside the Pentagon, Colonel Charles Burnsteel and Colonel Dean Rusk were asked to come up with a dividing line. They had one major goal: keep as much of Korea as possible under American responsibility while still choosing a line the Soviets might accept. They studied the map, and then they saw Seoul, Korea's capital. The 38th parallel placed Seoul south of the line, so they chose it. Not because the 38th parallel was some ancient Korean border. It wasn't. It was simply a line drawn during an emergency, a military boundary, a temporary arrangement for accepting Japan's surrender. But then something unexpected happened. The Soviet Union accepted it. Soviet troops took control north of the 38th parallel. American troops took control south of it, and suddenly Korea was no longer being treated as one occupied territory. It had been divided into two zones, but the Koreans themselves had not drawn that line. They had not voted for it. They had not asked for it, and yet their future was now being decided around it. The United States and Soviet Union both claimed the division was temporary, but while they were deciding what came next, something much bigger was happening. Two completely different political systems were beginning to take shape on opposite sides of the line. And that is when a temporary military boundary began turning into something permanent. In part 3, we uncover how those two zones became two completely different Koreas. Korea was supposed to be one country again. So why did two completely different governments rise instead? When the 38th parallel was created in 1945, the division was supposed to be temporary. The United States controlled the South, the Soviet Union controlled the North, and both powers said they wanted Korea to eventually become one independent country. But there was a problem. The Americans and Soviets had completely different ideas about what Korea's future should look like. In the North, the Soviet Union helped build a communist political system. Land was redistributed, industries were brought under state control, and a new political leadership began taking shape. In the South, the United States supported a very different system. Political parties competed for influence. Private property remained important, and American officials pushed for a government that would be aligned with the Western world. Korea was still technically one country, but on the ground, two different systems were developing. Then came another major problem. Who would actually decide Korea's future? The United States wanted international cooperation. The Soviet Union had its own plans, and negotiations between the two powers began breaking down. By 1947, the United States took the Korean question to the newly created United Nations. The idea was simple: hold elections and allow Koreans to establish their own government. But there was a huge problem. The Soviet Union refused to allow the UN Commission into the North. So elections were held only in the South. And in May 1948, South Koreans went to the polls. A few months later, the Republic of Korea was officially established. Then the North responded. In September 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was established, and suddenly the temporary division had produced something much bigger. Two governments, two political systems, two competing claims to represent all of Korea. Neither side believed the other was the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. And now, the question was no longer simply how to reunify Korea. The question was which Korea would control the future. And that question would soon lead to something far more devastating: war. In part 4, we uncover how the rivalry between these two new Koreas exploded into the Korean War. At dawn, thousands of soldiers crossed a line that was never supposed to become a border. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. Tanks and soldiers poured into South Korea. The temporary boundary had finally become a battlefield. South Korean forces were caught off guard. They struggled to stop the advance. Within days, Seoul was under attack. The South Korean government was forced to retreat, and suddenly the division of Korea had become a full-scale war. But this was no longer just a conflict between North and South Korea. The United States saw the invasion as a major threat. President Harry Truman ordered American forces to support South Korea. The United Nations also backed military action. Troops from multiple countries were sent to fight alongside South Korea. The war quickly became an international confrontation. At first, North Korean forces pushed deep into the south, but then the United Nations forces launched a bold counterattack. In September 1950, American-led forces landed at Incheon. The operation caught North Korean forces by surprise. Seoul was recaptured, and the front line began moving north. United Nations forces crossed the 38th parallel. They pushed toward the Chinese border, but China was watching, and when Chinese leaders feared that enemy forces were approaching their territory, China entered the war. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops crossed into Korea. The balance changed again. United Nations forces were pushed back south. Seoul changed hands once more, and the war became a brutal struggle over territory. For 3 years, the front line moved back and forth across the peninsula. Millions of soldiers and civilians were killed, wounded, or displaced. Entire cities were destroyed. Families were separated, and Korea was devastated. By 1951, neither side could achieve a decisive victory. The fighting eventually settled around the same general area where the war had begun, the 38th parallel. Then, in July 1953, the fighting finally stopped. An armistice was signed, but there was a catch. There was no peace treaty. The Korean War had stopped, but technically, the war never officially ended. A demilitarized zone was created between North and South Korea, and the temporary line from 1945 had become one of the most heavily guarded borders on Earth. A line drawn during an emergency had divided a country. A war had killed millions, and after all of that, the line was still there today. North Korea and South Korea remain divided, and the story that began with a temporary boundary still has not truly ended. This is the story of how one Korea became two, and if you want the complete story, watch the full documentary.